When I was a kid, my grandmother, who was born in 1880 in Elgin, would often refer to the wealthiest people in Elgin as big butter and egg men. And I never quite understood what that meant. As I got a little older and got involved in the Historical Society and understood the impact of the Board of Trade, the dairy and butter business in Elgin, I realized what she was referring to. They were some of the wealthiest people in Elgin, but that term, big butter and egg men, still tickles me today.
The land that surrounds Elgin has a story to tell. 200 years ago, this was virgin prairie, dotted with little woodlots. After European settlement, it was converted to farmland. By the late 19th century, most of this land was being used for dairy farming. In fact, an active dairy farm was right here. The barnyard was right behind me in this clump of trees. Today, the land's owned by the Forest Preserve District. Here at Fitchie Creek, the district is trying to bring back some of that prairie in an attempt to protect this ecologically significant place. Dairies to Prairies is the story of the evolution of this land and the contending forces which have shaped its past and will determine its future. Those being development, agriculture, and efforts to preserve open space and restore natural prairies.
Good morning, Sarah.
Hi, how are you, Phil?
Are you ready for this?
I definitely am.
All right, let's do it.
Perfect.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. You were born and raised in Elgin?
Yep, I was born and raised here and lived most of my life on Russell Road.
Aha, so Russell Road. So you're one of the road families.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Yes, I am. So dairy farming has been in my family for generations. My great-grandfather, Ira Newell, and grandmother Alice were farmers out here, and they did dairy farming.
Well, we've asked you to do voiceover narration for the documentary here. Have you ever done anything like that?
I have never done anything like this before.
All right, well, thank you for doing it. We just thought it would be cool to have somebody with their roots and heritage in dairy farming be the voice of our documentary. So thanks for being a willing participant.
I'm excited to be a part of the project.
All right, Sarah, are you ready?
I'm all set.
All right, well, give it a shot.
Okay.
Major funding for Dairies to Prairies was provided by King County Riverboat Fund, supporting a variety of projects and programs aimed at strengthening King County communities, and by the EFS Foundation, supporting a broad spectrum of community projects and programs in Elgin and close surrounding communities. The City of Elgin Cultural Arts Commission, supporting arts-related projects, exhibits, and performances within Elgin. And the Florence B. and Cornelia A. Palmer Foundation. Additional funds provided by Triumph Bank and the Gail Borden Public Library Foundation. Dairies to Prairies was also made possible by generous donations from Jerry and Ken Barnhart, Terry Gable and Sue Brigham, the Funk family, Betsy Son, Aubrey and Rachel Neville, Mike and Carol Kenyon, Margaret Kruger, the Damish family, and Jerry and Kathy Turnquist, in addition to contributions from these caring individuals and organizations.
I love collecting, I love Elgin, and the combination of the two makes for a great hobby. Nice thing about Elgin is that it was a manufacturing town that put stuff out all over the world, and those products and their advertising and their containers are available. So we tend to try and find those items. One of the items I enjoy collecting the most are milk bottles. Elgin was a dairy capital of the United States, and there were a lot of dairies in town, a lot of milk bottles. We've got quite a few on display in our house, such as this one, and I'm always on the hunt for more.
Somewhere 35 years ago, I started collecting milk bottles because that was the business I was in. Although I never handled glass bottles, that was always paper bottles. But the glass has a history to them, and I started collecting them for that history. With the bottles you see in this room, I have an equal amount stored in storage, so I just am not collecting anymore at this time unless they're very important. But checking into the history of the Elgin dairy industry, I can come up with 140 plus dairies that I can find. And the first dairy that there was any record of goes back to pre-Civil War, and he had a total of 2 cows that he kept next to his house. He milked the cows, put it in a vessel, and took it out and ladled it out to the customers.
Dairy farming wasn't a business in Elgin or elsewhere in Illinois in the mid-1800s. A farmer would perhaps own a milking cow or two as a way of providing milk for the family, and might sell or trade excess milk to a neighbor, but the business of dairy farming didn't really exist.
We're at Lord's Park on the city's Near East Side. It's one of the city's grandest, most beautiful parks. It was a gift to the city by George and Mary Lord in the early 1890s. This land, however, was originally owned by Dr. Joseph Teft, the city's first mayor, one of the first members of the Board of Trade, very prominent in Elgin circles in a lot of ways. In the early 1850s, one of the men who farmed part of this land for Dr. Teft, Phineas Smith, decided as an alternative to raising crops that he would ship milk to Chicago on the railroad. The railroad had just reached Elgin in the early 1850s, and Smith used oxen to haul milk to the near west side of Elgin and ship milk to a hotel that he had contracted with in Chicago. Other farmers soon caught on and started shipping their milk to Chicago, which had a great need for milk as the city was growing tremendously at that time, and Elgin's dairy industry was underway. So we're just west of the Fox River, south of Chicago Street, and this is the area where the train station existed, where milk was first shipped to Chicago. This area was originally known as the station as the Chicago and Galena Union, but before long would become the High Northwestern to many Elginites. High Northwestern Railroad, in contrast to the Low Northwestern, it ran at a lower elevation on the east side of the river. Records show that in 1858, about 21,000 gallons of milk was shipped by Elgin dairy farmers to Chicago. The following year, that number had jumped to 250,000 gallons. Along with this, Elginite David Barclay, who is credited with making the can that milk was first shipped to Chicago, also started making other dairy-related products, including pails, utensils, ladles, and other things. Other hardware dealers also hired tinsmiths as this burgeoning dairy business started to really grow in Elgin.
Dairying was not a big crop in Illinois until you get the growth of the cities. Elgin's very fortunate in the sense that the first railroad going west out of Chicago, the Galena and Chicago Union Railroad, connecting the Mississippi River with Chicago, that goes through Elgin. And it's built not from Galena to Chicago, it's built from Chicago to Galena. And it gets to Elgin, and it stops for a couple of years. And Elgin becomes, in a sense, the terminal of the first Western Railroad, and precedents had been developed already in New York, Boston, Philadelphia for shipping milk by railroads into the city. So Elgin didn't have any competition really at the very, very start, because the other railroads that were just building, and that milk that coming from the rich farmland around Elgin was a big success in Chicago.
Selling milk was more profitable than selling wheat or grain, so farmers got busy converting their operations to the business of dairy, buying more and more cows. But without refrigeration, farmers struggled to get their milk to market before it spoiled. One of Elgin's most beloved citizens came up with a solution.
We're at the corner of South and Vine on Elgin's near west side. This was originally the home of Sam Kimball, who farmed this area many years ago. There were 3 gushing springs on this property which ran downhill and formed a creek which converged and flowed into the nearby Fox River. As the business of dairying increased, Sam Kimball saw the need to keep milk cool. So he built the first milk house in this area and piped water from these springs into vats in which the milk could be set to cool. The idea really caught on, and neighboring farmers also started doing the same thing. Before long, some of this water was actually piped into wooden pipes that were actually transported and carried water into the center city area. Sam Kimball didn't really profit from his milk house idea and went deep into debt buying cows. When he couldn't make his payments, creditors had his cattle auctioned off at a public sale. But he was surprised to learn that his neighbors had actually bought the cattle and given it back to him. George Bailey would have been proud of Sam Kimball. It truly was a wonderful life.
Dairy farms were cropping up throughout the Fox River Valley. There were 3 main reasons for their success. Close proximity to Chicago, one of the country's biggest and fastest growing cities. The railroad between Elgin and Chicago that provided direct access for shipping milk, and an abundance of rich farmland and clean water. In 1865, a new operation opened in Elgin that proved to be a major game changer for Elgin's entire dairy industry.
So we're at the corner of Symphony Way and North Grove Avenue in downtown Elgin on the near east side. Gail Borden, a pioneer in the food preservative industry, established a milk condensing plant on this site in 1865. The operation soon became a major consumer of milk from area farmers. By 1889, Borden's workforce had increased to nearly 200. The plant required 10,000 gallons of milk each day to meet the demand. This was supplied by some 6,000 cows on 107 nearby dairy farms. Borden had strict standards for his farmers in terms of what the cows were fed, cleanliness, how quickly the milk was delivered to the plant, and things like this. These quality control standards were ultimately adopted by nearly all of the Elgin area farmers, giving Elgin a great reputation for quality. Production at the plant ceased in 1918 due to a variety of factors, but the operation left its mark in Elgin in a variety of ways. The Gail Borden Public Library, located nearby, is named in his honor.
I'm Carol Metal, Executive Director of the Gail Borden Public Library. This is actually the third permanent home of the Gail Borden Library. The second home, which was in use from 1968 until 2003, when we moved into this new building, was at 200 North Grove Avenue. But the first permanent home of the library was actually on Spring Street at the old Schofield Mansion that was purchased by Alfred and Samuel Church and donated to the city of Elgin for a public library, with one stipulation, that it be forever and always known and called the Gail Borden Public Library in honor of their stepfather. Gail Borden was a fascinating man, very interesting life. He did many things throughout his life. He was born in 1801 in New York and to a farming family. They later moved west, first to Kentucky and then to Indiana, continued farming. Because of health reasons, Gail Borden then moved to the south, living in New Orleans, Mississippi, and eventually Texas. He became an accomplished surveyor. He was instrumental in starting the first newspaper in Texas, and alongside of Stephen Austin and Sam Houston, he was very involved in Texas independence from Mexico. Along the way, he got interested in the preservation of food. At age 51, Gail Borden turned to work that would eventually bring him fame and wealth, and that was the preservation of milk, what we call condensed milk. He boiled off the water and milk in an airtight vacuum, similar to those he had seen the Shakers of New Lebanon, New York use when they condensed and preserved sugar, fruit juices, and extracts. Borden's invention was the vacuum pan, for which he received a U.S. patent in 1856. He opened a plant in Connecticut, and then he opened another one in New York. In 1861, he received a contract from the Union Army to provide condensed milk to the soldiers who were fighting in the Civil War. And this changed everything. This was the turning point. And in fact, during those years of the Civil War, they couldn't even keep up with production. So after the Civil War, Gail Borden wanted to expand westward in various cities, and he wanted a plant near the Chicago area. He learned about Elgin through his third wife, Emmeline Church, and he thought it would be a wonderful location for his operation. By the end of 1866, the Elgin Milk Condensing Company was in full swing. It became Elgin's second largest industrial employer. Although Gail Borden never lived in Elgin, his name lives on in our community through the Gail Borden Library.
With the unprecedented success of the Borden operation, milk was flowing like never before.
When the supply of fluid milk exceeded the demand, some farmers began making cheese. One of these factories that did this was located here at Ball and Harvey Streets, not too far from where we're at here right now. The residue from that factory ran down the side of the hill in Buttermilk Creek, and some of the residents would take that residue and feed it to their animals, giving the name Slop Hill. People were proud to call Slop Hill their home. After World War II, some of them began a Slop Hill golf tournament, which was a very prestigious golf tournament that went on for 50 years in Elgin. The boundaries of Slop Hill are roughly Highland Avenue on the south, Wing Street on the north, the river on the east, and McClure on the west. Some residents that lived outside that area still wanted to call themselves Slop Hill residents because this was a neighborhood that people were so proud of.
Butter and cheese production became new profit centers for Elgin's dairy industry. Creameries, which process milk for butter and cheese, began popping up all around Elgin.
Over my shoulders is what many people in Elgin know as the Butterman Mansion. It's a little hard to see here with all the trees and growth at this particular time, but we do have quite a few pictures at the Historical Museum that provide people a much better view of this. For many years, it was in two different dairy families in Elgin, giving it this name of the Butterman's Mansion, and a restaurant would actually operate here later with that same name. This house was built in the early 1890s by John Newman. He was a very wealthy person in Elgin. Newman owned or controlled over 50 different creameries within 50 miles of Elgin, starting with the Springbrook Creamery about 6 miles southwest of the city. Newman's operation involved over 50,000 cows producing some 500,000 quarts a day, equaling about 7-8 million gallons of milk per year. And eventually some of the people who had made their fortune in the dairy business like this were referred to by various Elginites as big butter and egg men. John Newman would later become president of the Elgin Board of Trade, which would have great influence over setting dairy prices not only in Elgin, but for much of the country for decades. The Elgin Board of Trade was essentially formed as a cooperative between farmers called producers and factory men, those who owned the creameries in the area that made butter and cheese. Producers and factory men were having trouble with the commission men, or the middlemen who sold their milk, butter, and cheese in Chicago. These commission men were repackaging Elgin's superior quality products under competing labels like Orange County butter and New York full cream cheese, and were selling these bogus labels at higher prices than were paid to the Fox Valley producers. To add insult to injury, the commission men were notoriously slow to pay their bills, and all this aggravated the Fox Valley producers and factory men and led to the formation of the Elgin Board of Trade in March 1872. The idea was that instead of selling their dairy products in Chicago via commission men, buyers would come to Elgin and directly deal with the producers and factory men, essentially cutting out the middlemen. Initially, buyers scoffed at the idea of traveling to Elgin to make these buys, but the quality of the Elgin product drove demand, and soon buyers are making the weekly trek to Elgin for Monday's call. The board not only stabilized the market with regards to pricing and distribution, it enforced strict grading standards for quality, which had been informally established years earlier when Borden's condensing plant set up shop in Elgin in 1865.
I think the condensed milk factory is the direct antecedent of the Elgin Board of Trade. It comes a few years earlier, but their insistence on cleanliness of the dairy and proper feeding, proper handling of the animals, proper transportation of the milk. You had to have that to get a contract for delivering milk to the condensed milk factory.
The board adopted quality as its watchword and based its published quotations on extras, which were a higher grade of extra creamery butter that have become the gold standard for butter quality nationwide. The board's influence continued to spread on a market-by-market basis as commissions and exchanges throughout the country routinely listed Elgin's weekly price quotations. A publication called the Elgin Dairy Report with the motto, "Elgin makes the price, we tell you what it is," began circulation in 1891. However, when some of the western and southern states complained they weren't getting the report in the mail on a timely basis, the Elgin Dairy Report installed a telegraph to publish the quotations, which added even more impact to the board's far-reaching influence.
One of the important connections between the railroad and the Board of Trade in Elgin is the fact that along the railroads you usually strung telegraph wires, and the prices, as soon as they were set, the word could go out across the country by the telegraph system. That was big news across the country for other dairy cooperatives. And so Elgin, for a while, set the standard, basically, of not only the quality, but also the price.
The Elgin Board of Trade had become a powerhouse in the commodities market, and many of its board members became wealthy in the process. People like John Newman, William H. Hintz, and Charles Gould made their fortunes off creameries, while others like McClure, Larkin, and McLean built their fortunes with large dairy herds. So how much money are we talking about? Well, in 1892, for example, 30,496,284 pounds of butter were sold on the Elgin Board of Trade at a cash value of $7,725,725. Remember now, this is 1892 money. $1 in 1892 would be worth about $24 today. So $7,725,725 worth of butter sold on the board in 1892 would be about $190 million in today's currency. Another $589,560 is sold in cheese, which is about $14 million today. So around $204 million worth of butter and cheese in today's money was sold on the Elgin Board of Trade in 1892 by local producers and factorymen. But that doesn't include sales of fluid milk, as the board only dealt in butter and cheese. We know that about half of the milk produced in the Fox Valley was sold as fluid milk. So the dairy industry in Elgin and surrounding communities like Plato, Udina, Hampshire, Dundee brought in nearly $300 million into the local economy, and that's not counting the ancillary businesses, such as the Elgin Butter Tub Company. The other thing to consider is that the population in this area was a lot less back then. The city of Elgin had a population around 18,000, about 1/6 of the size that it is today. So that $300 million would have had an even greater impact on our community in 1892. So we can get a sense of just how important the dairy industry was to Elgin and the Fox Valley and how much money this industry brought into the community. And the money stayed here. These weren't multinational corporations or even out-of-state concerns where profits were being sent to stockholders elsewhere. For the most part, that nearly $300 million stayed with the producers and factorymen here in the Fox Valley. The Elgin Board of Trade closed in 1917 due to a variety of factors, including allegations of price fixing and a gradual loss of interest from local producers who were selling nearly all their cows could produce to the city of Chicago as fluid milk. As a result, butter output from the area creameries decreased by almost 30% in the 10 years between 1899 and 1909, with the demand for fluid milk nearly doubled. Although 1911 was a record-setting year for the board and butter sales, most of that butter was coming from Wisconsin, Iowa, and elsewhere. The extra creamery butter that the board was famous for selling was in short supply. By the early teens, the Elgin area creameries were shutting down and the volume of trades decreased substantially, so as to make the board an insignificant concern on the national scene. On November 1st, 1917, the U.S. Food Administration announced that it had requested the president of the Elgin Butter Board to suspend operations during the period of the war. Acting President Joseph Newman complied. The board never reopened.
The demise of the Board of Trade did not signal the end of Elgin's dairy industry. The B.S. Pearsall Butter Company, which ironically sold a butter substitute called oleomargarine, became Elgin's biggest creamery in the 19-teens and 20s. And of course, dozens of Elgin area dairies continued to provide home delivery to Elgin and surrounding communities.
In the 1930s, Elgin had 30 different dairies. Behind me was one of them. The Cloverleaf Dairy was here from 1932 to 1936, and this is an example of one of their bottles. This pint bottle from the Cloverleaf Dairy includes the address of 633 Raymond. This is a pick, and the pick was used to pick the cap out of the bottle. The lid pick includes Cloverleaf Dairy with their phone number. The idea obviously was to get the housewife to make a phone call for more milk. We're here on the corner of Preston and Cooper on the northeast side of Elgin. The building behind me in July of 1937 opened up as the very new Elgin Homes Dairy and Store. One of the nice things about the George Abraham Company was that his drivers owned their own routes. In fact, behind me where the garages are was a driveway, and that was where the trucks would come in, pick up their product to go out on the routes. These small dairies would sell not only milk, but cottage cheese, sour cream, eggs, a lot of things a homemaker needed to get breakfast ready for the family. This half-pint bottle I'm holding would have held cream. It was filled by the George Anderson Dairy, which is located at the corner of Mill and McClure Avenue in the north side of Elgin. The garage behind us is where all that dairy operation would have occurred. George and his family lived in a very nice house in front of it. One great thing about Anderson is he was around from 1909 to 1945 and did a lot of advertising. We've got calendars and Elgin city directories proclaiming that his dairy men delivered milk throughout the entire city of Elgin. This bottle is one of my favorites because the typesetter misspelled McClure. He put an N instead of an R, so instead of 237 McClure, this dairy was at 237 McClune. Here we are at the corner of Locust and Vine. Behind me is the building that housed all of the milking equipment for the Charles Hawker Dairy. In 1942, he retired, and the location was bought by Harry Benson. Behind me is a building that may be well known to many Elginites. It was the Benson Ice Cream Shop. One of those unfortunate things that occurred many times when the dairy went out of business. Mr. Benson sat on the curb and broke the bottles, so that makes bottles very difficult to come by. However, here's a nice half-pint bottle from the Charles Hawker Dairy. The great thing about it is it includes the 130 Vine Street address on the bottle. Harry Benson and his staff broke a lot of the bottles, but they couldn't break the cardboard ice cream containers like the one I'm holding here. Did you ever get ice cream out of this?
My father had a dairy that he built a house first on the corner of Cook Cane and Bent Street on the southeast end of Elgin. Behind it was his bottling plant. And he had that probably till about, well, he lost it near the end of the Depression.
Park Road Dairy, which was less than a mile east of the Lower Lagoon in Lords Park. We were one of the smaller dairies. Dad bought that dairy from a guy named Jens Nielsen, and it was during the Depression. Yet, I mean, we had no money, you know, and so he somehow got into that dairy business without putting out money. Because I can still remember him saying, if we get in $1 a day, we'll make it, you know.
When I was 6 years old, I was my dad's route jumper. And that was, you had metal carriers and all glass bottles, of course. And he'd do the driving, and I'd get out and run up, put it in either the box, a lot of them in the back porch at an ice box. And I did that all through grade school. Of course, you meant getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning too, you know, get to go and load the truck and all that, you know. He'd take me back over after we got through with the route and drop me off at St. Mary's grade school.
And then as I got older, started helping him on the milk route, and that would be before he'd dump me off at Columbia School to go to school. And so then you'd take your flashlight and your carrier and walk up to the back porch or wherever, and some of the houses, not like today, you'd go in the house with the milk, even put it in their refrigerator, believe it or not. And then they'd have empty bottles sitting there for us to pick up, because that was a big deal back then. You had to get your empty bottles back. Of course, on the trucks back then, a lot of the dairies had Divco step-and-go trucks, they call them, where you stood driving up, and you could just walk in and out of it. Well, we didn't. We had the good old panel truck. And I sat on an upside-down milk crate with a pile of papers under me as padding, and really safe, you know.
When I was little, we lived on 433 Division Street. Everybody at that time seemed to have their milk delivered. And I don't know what time the man came, but by the time it was time to get up and have cereal in the morning, the cream from the top had been frozen, and it would come out the top because it would be a bottle like this. And then the cream always was here because we didn't have homogenized milk. And then that cream would freeze and it would come up, and then the cap to it would be on top, so it was like a little hat. And it was always a treat to have that on our breakfast cereal in the morning.
Well, I was born and raised and grew up in Elgin, Illinois, on Fremont Street. Fremont Street was a part of the settlement, what they called the settlement back then. And that settlement is where the heart of the black community was, where they built their first cabins and everything. And so a good friend of ours on Hickory Street named Jim Stoll, his father was a milkman for Ludwig Dairy. And I remember him coming in, he's standing up and in the truck and driving the truck with the shift up here and getting out and putting your milk on your steps and wherever, and taking milk bottles back with him. I came from a large family, so my dad's business was going real good. We might get a gallon or maybe 2 gallons. When it wasn't going so good, we would get a lesser amount. My parents substituted Kool-Aid for milk. A lot of black families did. Kool-Aid was the drink of choice.
When he sold his business to Benson Dairy, Benson owned a dairy bottling plant, and farmers brought their milk there. And when he worked at Benson Dairy, the Benson family got the truck route in Woodruff and Edwards Foundry in Elgin. And of course, my dad was working for him, so we would go over there, pick the milk up at the Benson Dairy on Vine Street, go down there and pull on the side, and there was steps because it was all dirt floor. It was from State Street to Kimball Street along that plant. My dad would push this cart, big cart, with cases of pints of orange juice, pints of chocolate milk, and pints of regular white milk. He'd push it, and the guys would call out, "Give me 2 orange," or "Give me 2 chocolate," and boom, I'd have to run, it'd be 30 feet away from me or so. Come back. My dad would keep wheeling the cart. It would take us probably 3 hours to go through there, And it's hot. In the summer it's terribly hot. The furnace is going.
We're on Raymond Street, just south of Bypass 20 in Elgin. As Elgin's dairy industry began to grow in the early years, various businesses appeared to help support this growing industry. One was a firm established by Casper Schmidt in 1866, which made butter tubs. The Elgin Butter Tub Company grew to be the largest manufacturer of butter tubs in the world. When demand for butter tubs fell off in the 1930s, the company transitioned into the corrugated box industry. Elgin Butter Tub Company would eventually become Elgin Corrugated Box, that would continue to run its operation here on Raymond Street for another 70+ years.
Many other companies sprang up in Elgin to support the dairy industry. For example, Mason and Lawrence Silos. With its patented rib stone double seal design, built over 4,000 silos in and around Elgin, many of which still stand today.
My name is John Ludwig. I'm the grandson of Oscar Ludwig, who started the Ludwig Milk Company in 1911. He was born in 1875 in Weberstadt, Germany. Came here as a boy. He ended up in Chicago, and through the German club in Chicago found a job in Wheaton at a dairy farm. Got interested in the business and eventually bought a couple of routes, and that's how Elgin Sanitary Milk Company got started.
This is one of Oscar Ludwig's old wagons, which I found up in Wisconsin and put it into my collection. And I've been collecting probably 30 years now. But it is the only wagon that I know of from Elgin. Elgin Homes Dairy, Modern Dairy, I have never found or seen or know of any wagon that they have. This is the only wagon that I've ever come across. And back in those days, every town had wagon makers, so they made wagons as they needed them. And when you had a wagon with milk on it, in the summertime you had to put ice on the milk, so the wood would start rotting, and when it rotted far enough, they drove it to the city dump and left it there. And there's probably many milk wagons in the city dumps if you knew where they were. But generally, they are not in very good condition. This one happens to be in fairly good condition.
1930 roughly was when the name was changed. And it changed because to go out and sell something as Elgin Sanitary Milk Company, a little bit more difficult. And so the idea was, well, Oscar, just use your name. And that's how Ludwig Milk Company came about. My father, Ernie, Oscar's son, took over the business in the 40s and grew it until it was sold in the 70s.
The Ludwig Milk Company serves a broad area around Elgin, Chicago, and McHenry, Illinois, with healthful, delicious milk and milk products. At the Spring Street plant, the approved milk is pasteurized for purity, retaining all the rich, on-the-farm taste we all like so well. The pasteurized milk meets the sterilized bottles in another complicated maze of machinery that quickly fills the bottles with just the right amount of milk, and in what seems like the same operation, caps them and attaches an outer hood for added protection. This hood makes sure that dust and dirt will be kept out, so that the tops of the bottles of milk we open in our homes will be spotless.
I worked there as a teenager. I washed trucks, and then when I was old enough to drive, I did the home delivery routes. I also drove the semis, and I also did the farm route pickups. Elgin, we had 2 plants. We had one on Spring Street and one on Water Street down by Grove Avenue. and south of Brook Street. And Water Street was where we did initially we did all the paper carton packaging. And the Spring Street operation was all the glass filling. There's also an operation in Polo, Illinois, and that's where the cottage cheese was manufactured.
The company's famous cottage cheese is made in their country plant at Polo, Illinois. Ludwig's Country Fresh butter is also made at the Polo plant. It's a far cry from the days when we used a small churn around the house to churn out a pound or two of butter. The giant mechanical churn does the same kind of job, though, bringing out all the natural flavor that recalls the true taste of homemade butter.
When I was growing up, there were 3 dairies, actually just 2. There was Ludwig and Modern. That was it. Yes, Borden was out there, and we knew they were around, but it wasn't the same. And there was a Batavia dairy down in Batavia, but in Elgin, when we were growing up, it was just Ludwig and Modern.
I worked, I think, totally a little over 60 years in the distribution business for dairy products. My father was in the dairy industry. My dad was general manager for the Dean Food Company, or Dean Milk Company as they were called at that point. And every Sunday he would take my mother and she would go down and work on the books, and he would do something, and I got to wash trucks with Howard Dean. He later became chairman of the board of the Dean Food Company, but at that point he was nothing but the founder's son, and he got to wash the top of the trucks, and I had to wash the wheels and the bottom part. And Mr. Dean had maybe 20 trucks. He was only going to deliver to grocery stores. He wanted to deliver in Chicago, but the city would not allow him to do that. It was a big challenge every place they went because the unions didn't want them. The storekeepers didn't realize they could sell milk. They had no place to put it. Dean opened some milk stores trying to sell milk and everything, and they finally succeeded, and it became a lead item for grocery stores, the dairy, because it was a product that was consumed very quickly, and the housewife would have to come back into the store many times to pick up milk. And when she was in there, if they couldn't sell her a loaf of bread or a pound of sugar, there was something wrong with them. Well, the union did not want it sold to stores. They wanted it home delivery because it took more people to deliver it that way. And in about 1934, when Sam Dean came up with the idea that grocery stores could sell a lot of milk, he ran into a lot of problems at that point because the unions were very much against him. If you look at the wagon behind me here, if he put on 15 cases of milk, that was a lot of work for him that day because he was delivering 1 quart and then run back to the wagon and go to the next house. When I was delivering milk, I would put between 1,000 and 1,300 cases of milk on 1 truck. So you can see the number of union employees I displaced. At that time I was sending into Chicago over 60 trailer loads of milk a day. And the ice cream probably had another 20 trailers a day. We were the largest Haagen-Dazs distributor in the world, and we were actually the largest dairy distributor in the United States.
And the home delivery became too expensive. Cost of gasoline in the 70s, cost of trucks, wages. People were more interested in going to a store and getting the milk while they were there. And stores like Gromer's and others that we served were using milk as a loss leader to draw people in through the store so they'll come in, buy them a box of macaroni and cheese to get the half gallon of milk. And I think that was what ultimately led to the end of it.
We're in the farmyard of Kenyon Brothers, 4th generation farmer here in South Elgin, Illinois. There are 3 dairy farmers in Kane County. There's none in Cook County or DuPage County anymore. We probably have 170 to 180, and that includes the young stock. These are the milk cows. Their milk goes to market. They're milked twice a day. They probably are milked for 300 plus days, 305. And and then they get dried off, and they have a rest period, and then they have their calf, and they start all over. They're Holsteins. These are the easiest to take care of, and they give the most milk. Black and white with some spots. The red and white are what's called the red and white Holsteins, and there's 2 others that are of different breed. The Oriole cows, if you noticed them. Their body, they're white in the middle and black on these ends, like an Oreo cookie.
Well, I'm Tom Corrin, great-grandson of the early settler, my great-grandfather Robert Corrin. We're here at historic Corrin Farm. We're in Camden Township, south of McDonald Road, north of Silver Glen, and along Corrin Road, named after my family. The original was 220 acres that my great-grandfather settled in 1835, and later expanded to up to 300 and some acres. Robert came from Virginia. He drove a wagon pulled by a couple oxen. His brother had left Virginia first. Joseph was his name. He moved to South Elgin, and he's an ancestor of the Kenyans. So we're related there. But when Robert came out from Virginia, part of the deal back then was you had to lay claim to this land here, and then a few years later, after you built a structure, built a home, and started farming, you had to do all these things to qualify for the purchase that you could make, and great-grandpa did that like in I can't remember exactly, 1840, 1843, and then purchased the land for $1.25 an acre, which was pretty pricey back then, but still a wonderful deal.
The farm I grew up on was called Triple Oaks Farm. Originally it was purchased in 1837 for $1.25 an acre. Route 72 and Big Timber Road cross right about where our farm is. It's about 640 acres. And of course, as each generation came along, they inherited their share. So the farm became smaller and smaller, so it ended up my dad had 160 acres. That's what I grew up on. I would say we were milking maybe 35 in stanchions. We then had to truck our milk over to Pingree Grove. And there at a siding, they had a place where the Bowman Dairy Company brought in a double semi from Chicago, and we'd give them 8-gallon cans of milk. And our milk supply was probably about 18 to 20 cans every morning.
George Muirhead came here from Scotland in 1850. He had 13 children. He had his first child when he was 18, and he had his last child when he was 65. His sons took up farming, and his daughters married farmers in the area. Our farm here was developed by George's son, James, my great-grandfather, who ran the general store in Plato Center. He had access to wholesale building materials as a result of running the store. So he and 2 of his brothers went into business as the Muirhead brothers. And they had the store, and they developed farms for tenants. So our farm was developed as a tenant farm. The buildings were put up in 1900, and we've been here ever since.
My name is Maureen Kelly, and I'm the official historian of the Memorial Washington Reformed Presbyterian Church and Cemetery. The church is 175 years old. There's about 10 to 15 founding families who all came here approximately in the 1840s and found this ground and established a church. Those first families who came here came from Scotland and Northern Ireland, and they were Scottish Presbyterians. So the names that were prominent in this area for generations and are still living in this area are the McCornacks, the McQueens, the Gage family, Rileys, Moores, Damish. A lot of them were dairy farms, and most of the farmers here sent milk into Elgin or to Chicago on the train. There was a railroad station here, so this was called as kind of a settlement, not really a town or a village, but it was called McQueen Station. And so McQueen Station was a major railroad point for these farmers to get whatever they produced to get it to markets.
My ancestors came over from Scotland around 1840s, and they were looking for something that looked like Scotland. And because of the hills around here, that's why they selected this particular area. They settled on McCornack Road, which is just north of here in that direction, about 2 miles. It's still a gravel road, still a very historical place to our family. I believe I've got like 7 or 8 generations buried here in this cemetery.
We're one of the road families. There are other roads around that are named for the farm families. There's Ripburger Road that goes into Plato Center. The Russells, Newell Russell and his sons lived on Russell Road. The way that the roads got their names, when Ernest Ures was road commissioner, he needed to tell people where to go to fix the roads. And there were really no reference points. You know, it's kind of go to the Struve farm or whatever. So he decided that the roads needed names, and he named them after the farm families that he knew very well. He himself lived on Crawford Road and had farms there with that his sons operated. And the reason that Crawford Road is not Ures Road is that Ernest thought that it would be hubristic for him to name a road after himself. So out of modesty and humility, he named it after Duddy Crawford instead.
King County had hundreds of dairy farms, but this might be one of the more interesting ones. Hi, I'm Bill Briska, historian of the Elgin Mental Health Center. I'm standing on the back lot of what was formerly part of the hospital property, and behind me you could see the iconic towers from the power plant, and over my right shoulder is the laundry building erected in the 1960s. Now these buildings are remnants of a much larger institution. At one time though, this was the heart of the farming complex. During the late 19th century and first half of the 20th century, farming operations were centered here on the grounds. They later moved out to McLean Boulevard, but while they were centered here and there, those farming operations included not only vegetables, swine, chickens, but a large dairy herd. The dairy herd, which numbered about 60 head in the 19th century, grew up to over 100 head by the middle of the 20th century. The last remnant of the farm complex that was once on this property is the building that we're coming up on. This is the horse barn. Because it's a brick building erected in the 1890s, it survived, whereas the wooden buildings and the corn cribs and other smaller buildings associated with the farm have all gone their way. The original hospital, which opened in the 1870s, was designed for a population of 450 patients, not much different than what it is today. However, over time and by taking on different missions and roles, treating different types of patients, the hospital population zoomed up by the 1950s to nearly 7,000 patients. That's a lot of people to be feeding, clothing, and caring for every day. Dairy products, including milk, butter, and cream, were a regular part of the patient's diet here, and having a fresh source of milk on the grounds was a tremendous asset for the hospital.
My name's Dave Coron. I grew up here on this farm and been here pretty much my whole life. And my dad was his whole life, my grandpa and great-grandfather. Well, we're heading down to the dairy barn right now where we milk cows, my brother and I, and well, my dad too. We're down there every morning at 5 o'clock, and 5 o'clock in the afternoon we're milking them. Twice a day you milk cows, and didn't matter if it's Christmas Day or what, you're doing it 365 days a year. Milk was milk from the cow in buckets, and the milk was put from the buckets into a milk can. There's 2 tanks of well water out there that kept the milk cold. Every farmer had its own name and permit number and address on the can. So you take your cans out and put them on a train, they come in, next day they come back, you put your second set of cans on, and they go in. The can itself, I would say, weighs 10 to 15 pounds. It holds 8 gallons, and 8.6 pounds makes 1 gallon of milk. So the weight would be somewhere around 65, 66 pounds. Add the 10 or 15 pounds on, you're up near 80 pounds on a full can of milk. Every day the milk gets hauled down to Wasco train depot, either an old truck, buckboard, in wintertime it could be a sleigh.
My name is Carolyn Gathman, and I'm living on one of the McDonald farms. My mom was McDonald. My father worked for my grandfather, and he started in the 1930s. And my grandpa, he built us a house across the road and was considered a hired hand house. And so he worked for my grandpa until 1958 or so. And then my grandma and grandpa passed away. My folks continued on farming until my dad sold his dairy, I believe in 1973, and then he still continued to farm until 1985 when he complained about he couldn't lift the fertilizer bags anymore.
Grew up on a dairy farm out on Route 72, just 3 miles east of Dundee. It's Beverly Lake Forest Preserve now it's called. All born and raised out there, 9 boys, 6 girls. I was the second youngest. I got one sister younger. Having to milk by hand and all that out there, you had to have a lot of kids. So then he started expanding. My dad bought more cows. We bought cows from Kenyon. Holstein, so I had a few Jerseys in there, and a few Ayrshires. The Jersey and Ayrshire, they get more butter fat out of them, so that makes your butter fat go up, so you got more for your milk then. And we finally got up to 80 cows at one time. And we'd haul it to Modern Dairy ourselves in the cans, throw it on the truck, haul it down there.
And then I used to round up the cows for the evening milking. I didn't milk cows because I guess my dad had always had several kickers and he was afraid I'd get kicked by a cow. I did carry milk sometimes. We had 27 stanchions and Dad tried to keep it full. My dad used to use the surge milking machine. We had 2, one on each side of the barn at a time. He would just go from one to the other back and forth. I remember at least took a couple hours, twice a day, no matter what. Morning and night, and then in between time you go out and work in the field. It's a lot of hard work.
My dad usually got up at 4:30 in the morning, and his typical day was coming out and throwing down some feed for the cows, getting the milking machines ready. And he'd start milking, maybe 6-ish, and finish around 7, and then he could eat some breakfast. And after breakfast, he'd come out and clean up the milk house, sterilize the equipment, clean the barn, take all the manure and haul it out into the fields. And when he was done with that, then he could go out and work in the fields, cultivating or harvesting or whatever was appropriate to the season, until noon, at which point he would come in and eat about 5,000 calories for lunch, and take a 20-minute nap, and then back out into the fields till about 4 o'clock. And then he'd come in and do the whole milking routine again, prepare the equipment and throw down the feed and get the cows into the barn and milk them until about 7 o'clock in the evening, at which point he was done for the day. And he did that 6 days a week. On Sunday, all he did was milk the cows, so he only worked 6 or 7 hours on Sunday. That was his day off.
I started probably when I was 6 years old. I had to take care of the chickens, feed them, and make sure the eggs were gathered, and clean bedding, and that's the job I hated, is cleaning out the chicken house. Worst job you can find.
I'm an only child, so I had several chores that I had to do during the summer especially. One was hoeing thistles, which was not my favorite. I used to gather eggs at the noontime gathering. That wasn't one of my favorite things to do either, because I then run across the sitting hens on the nest and they wouldn't get off. You'd have to push them off and they'd pick.
Well, we had chickens and pigs. The chickens were my mother's project. That was typical on farms at that time. It was the woman's project, was doing the chickens and gathering the eggs.
But I remember coming back like after milking, and Aunt Cindy would have a great breakfast going. You know, that was quite the job of making sure you had enough food to feed all your family plus the hired hands, morning, noon, and night. And of course, farming, you're just dirty, and so the laundry was a huge job. You know, and then of course didn't have electricity or that, so the ovens and stoves were all wood-fired, so you had to have a bunch of firewood on hand as well. So there was always something to do.
We did everything: bale hay, pick corn, fill silo, Trash and the oats, feed the pigs, clean the barn and that, of course. And chickens, we had to feed them. We had turkeys, ducks, so I had to feed all of them. Good life, though, I'll tell you that.
You miss it?
Oh, yeah. Yep. Yeah, if I was younger, I wouldn't mind doing it.
It's quality of life. That's why you farm. It's quality of life. Not all about money. But money helps.
Our grandfather and his brothers started a calf buying operation back in the early 1900s, and they would go around, they would walk around the farms with a wagon that they would pull and buy calves. That kind of evolved in 1918. He started a cow buying and horse buying business.
He originally started horses, horses and mules, and it was just livestock. It didn't have to be a dairy cow. It could have been a goat. It didn't really matter what it was. He was going to buy it and turn around and sell it for a profit.
And that evolved into the Grand Hotel for dairy cattle at McLean and South Street. My dad, who joined my grandfather in the business after the war, Second World War, would buy cattle, a lot of cattle from Wisconsin and the area, and then they would sell them all over the United States. And they also had rooms above the office where cattle buyers could stay. They had bedrooms upstairs, and someone would come in to buy cattle. They could put them up and oftentimes send them out to dinner, and a lot of times at the Blue Moon, if people remember the Blue Moon, that's for sure.
Blue Moon. I would ride with him to Midway, and we'd pick up cattle buyers from Texas and South Carolina and Alabama, and I mean, they were all over everywhere. My dad would take them through the barn and show them the various cows. They were in the stanchions, and if we didn't have a cow that they liked, he would take them someplace else and try to sell them somebody else's cow. When my grandpa bought the farm back in 1926, he knew there was an easement through there.
Yep, Route 20 bypass right through the farm.
But he thought, well, there's state property just down the road, so they'll run it that way. But Route 20 was a U.S. highway, so they decided they're going to put it right through the farm, and they did.
Elgin experienced tremendous growth in the decades of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. New houses were cropping up on farmlands all over Elgin as development pushed west to Randall Road and beyond. Renowned local architect Charles Burnage took us on a tour of some dairy barns that still remain in our community.
Today we're going to tour a handful of barns, and we're going to look at the architectural styles, and we're going to look at the details and the functionality of the barns, and discuss how and why they were constructed in the manner in which they were. We're standing along Randall Road at the intersection of Hops and Randall. The traffic is whizzing by, as you can see, and almost 35,000 cars are going to pass this very spot today. But it's important to note that right adjacent to the intersection of Hops and Randall is the Geyer Farm. And this is a relic of our 19th century and 20th century dairy farming industry. And initially, when barns were painted red, some farmers thought that this was an extravagance, that this was vain, that farmers would paint their barns. However, when the barn wood was found to be deteriorating, they painted their barns red. The red paint was skim milk, which they derived from their cattle, red oxide, which is iron, and lime. And the mixture of this preserved the wood. Also, it heated up in the wintertime to make the barns warmer. So farmers changed their minds that it was a vain farmer that painted his barn red. We're currently heading south on Stevens Road, approaching a McDonald Road where there were 3 McDonald farms. We're at the Gathman Farm here on McDonald Road, and this is one of the 3 McDonald farms that were located on McDonald Road. And what is very interesting about this farm family is it's been continuous in the McDonald family since the middle 1800s. And the barn that is behind me was constructed in 1873. To my right, we have the original milk house where the windmill stood. This milk house was used for the earliest milking of the cows when they were hand milked. The other milk house has a bulk tank in it, and we will be looking at that. This barn is a gable end barn, and these were built soon after the Civil War and was the predominant barn type. But later, they built the gambrel roof to increase the storage area in the mow area. This is not a tall barn, but later the barns were built much taller and with much more storage. We're on the dairy floor in the dairy parlor, and you're looking at the stanchials. The dairy animals were milked twice a day, in the morning and in the afternoon, and they would go into their stalls. The different animals knew which was their stall, and this was the stanchion. The animal put its head in here and could reach around and put its nose into the watering basin. If it pushed on this plate, it would bring water into the basin, and then the animal could drink that water. And so every one of these stanchions has a water pipe that leads to these basins. The milk came from the milking parlor into this tank. There is like a cooling element that's part of this. This is to stir the milk. And then there was a nozzle here at the end that went out of the building where the milk was driven away in a very large truck. The dairy industry had to improve their means of keeping the milk cool, keeping the milk sanitary, and this was a modern means of doing that. There were 3 McDonald farms, and we're going to the second one, which is owned by the Heiniger family. This is a great example of everything that the textbooks talk about. It is a middle to late 19th century barn. You see the stone foundation. The stones were extracted from the fields and laid up. The stone area is the milking portion of the barn. You see a Mason and Lawrence silo. Mason and Lawrence was a major industry in Elgin, and in fact they had silo manufacturing facilities all over the United States at their height. It's concrete, it's put up in staves, concrete staves, and then the metal bands that you see wrapping around it are tightened to hold those staves in place. The barn itself is a board and batten farm, and you'll see the vertical boards and you'll see the vertical batten. On top of the barn are the beautiful ventilators, and this was a way of extracting heat from the buildup in the barn and the dairy area below. And you'll notice the eave line shadow on the barn, how straight it is across the barn. And that's showing you that this farm, or this barn, is located in almost direct east-west direction. And so farmers built these barns knowing the climatic conditions. This ramp is on the south side of the barn. If it were on the north side of the barn, you would have a snow buildup in front of the doors. The prevailing winds in the wintertime are out of the north and out of the northwest. And so you have an accumulation of snow that would build up against the barn and against the ramp. Not only that, all winter long, the sun would not be shining on the north side of the barn. And so that snow could accumulate and not melt until spring. So again, the farmers knew what they were doing and worked hard to arrange their buildings to give them the maximum protection from the elements, the maximum utilization of space, and the maximum care for their animals. We're now heading north on Schweitzer Road, and we're going to the Gerke Farm on the intersection of Route 20 and Schweitzer Road. This barn is located in a north-south direction, and it is a bank barn. And a bank barn means that the building is built into a hill. The bank barn was a common barn particularly in hilly country such as Wisconsin, because it insulated one wall of the lower floor of the barn. And therefore, in the wintertime when the cattle were in the barn, it was a very cold situation, but at least one of the walls was protected. This farm has 3 Mason and Lawrence silos. It's an indicator that this was a very active dairy farm in its history. Right now, we're traveling on Highland Avenue to the Universalist Unitarian Church. This building was the original barn on the Marshall Sherman farm. It was deconstructed and moved to this site and reconstructed as a church. We're on the 2nd floor of the Universalist Unitarian Church, just outside the sanctuary. And on the wall is a photograph of the original Marshall Sherman farm, which was located across from the Advocate Sherman Hospital. And it shows the original barn and the 2 houses. The barn was disassembled. Those beams and columns were moved to this location and reassembled in the sanctuary. We're now in the sanctuary, and this is the best view looking towards the chancel of the structure of the original barn. It's very similar to a European cathedral. And the way these barns were constructed before the modern equipment is these trusses, these post and beams, these pegged beams, mortise and tenon beams and columns would be assembled on the ground on top of the platform of the barn. Underneath was the dairy floor, and then the floor would be laid, and then multiple people, sometimes 100 if you had a big barn, would lift this structure. Then they would take poles with hooks on the end and they would push it into place. And then they would climb up the structure, holding it in place, to tack it to the next bay. And that's how, when you hear the term barn raising, that's how it was done. If you've ever had an opportunity to see the movie Witness, there is an example of barn raising in that movie that shows the detail and the people involved and the methods where they raised a barn in the Amish community. The Marshall Sherman barn that was located on Randall Road was disassembled and moved to this location and reconstructed, so it is adaptive reuse. And what is very meaningful about this is that we are fast losing our historic barns, but in most cases they're being torn down or let fall down. This is a case where a historic barn was relocated and reconstructed into a beautiful church, the Universalist Unitarian Church.
A century ago, when this magnificent dairy barn was erected, the Elgin city limits were 6 miles east of here. Today, this land has been annexed into the city of Elgin. What's happened to those dairy farms? Farming was a risky business. Some years you made money, some years you didn't. So when developers came along and offered high prices for these large tracts of land, many farmers cashed in and moved out.
I'm Bill Lenschow and my wife Kathy, and our kids, we've lived here, and my grandfather lived here. Grandpa started in the 1800s. It's been a dairy farm for 119 years. It's north of Plank Road, about a half mile on county line. From Plank Road and 20 intersection just west of Elgin, there used to be dairy farms on every single location almost west of Elgin. And now that has certainly changed. When you start looking at that, you think, why did that happen? They were offered by developers a sizable amount, from could be $50,000 to $100,000 an acre. They just couldn't turn that kind of money down.
I'm standing at the corner of Bowes and Randall Road. It's hard to imagine that just a few decades ago, Randall was no more than a country lane, dotted by farms and barns and open fields. Today, it's a vibrant retail corridor surrounded by residential development. Most of this development took place in the 1990s and early 2000s. Ed Schock was the 3-term mayor of Elgin at the time.
When developer interest in the West started to heat up,
we started to realize that there was going to be development pressure, and we could try to resist it, which we didn't think would be very realistic or beneficial actually, or we could plan for it. The Planning Commission had a big role to play, and our job was to make sure that it was well planned, well executed, and a benefit to the city. But I think it's important to understand, we didn't go out to these places and say, hey, we want an extra property. Those property owners were coming to us. They were ready to get out, sell, and make a lot of money. The developers were willing to pay premium prices per acre for that property.
My name is John Hoscheit. I'm a member of the Kane County Board from St. Charles. I'm also a member of the Kane County Forest Preserve District, and I've been on the County Board and Forest Preserve District for 22 years now. In the mid-1990s, the big issue in Kane County at that time was the growth that we were dealing with. And on the Forest Preserve side, there was a lot of land that was proposed to be developed, and a lot of the open space that we had enjoyed over the years was threatened, and so there was a movement to try to preserve that. In 1999, we had roughly 6,000 acres of open space, and by statute, the limitation of the Forest Preserve District in Kane County was to own 50,000 acres. And so we had roughly 11% of what we were able to acquire. And the district decided at that time, with the support of a lot of our local constituents, that open space preservation was critical, and that over a period of years we would move toward our goal of acquiring up to 50,000 acres. What we did is divide the county up into 3 linear corridors. The eastern third of the county we refer to as the urban corridor. That's where most of the development had already occurred, and it was critical for us to acquire property along the river primarily, and to preserve large open spaces that existed within the urban areas. The middle part of the county, the middle third of the county, is what we called the critical growth area, and that is where most of the development pressure existed, primarily for new residential construction. And that area was important because it had the headwaters to a number of streams. That area was the recharge area for a number of wells in the county. It also was an area where a significant amount of flood control existed, and the development pressure was endangering all those areas. So the primary focus of our acquisitions were to acquire and preserve as much space in the critical growth area that we could. And then the western third of the county was the corridor that we call the agricultural corridor. If we could acquire large tracts of land in that area to preserve open space, we saw that as a priority, but that was the area that we focused least on, because that area was likely to maintain its agricultural character.
Our mission is to protect open spaces, and it's just not acquiring any land. We're going to focus on open spaces, natural areas, wetlands, woodlands, greenways. We're focusing a lot on our regional trail systems and connecting our open spaces. Our residents would like to be able to walk or bike between preserves. And now that we've got these referendum under our belt, we're able to work even better with local agencies, park districts and municipalities, to work with not only development but other open spaces for full connectivity.
We're at Burnage Forest Preserve. This preserve is well over 600 acres, and it comprises woodland and prairie and some wetland. A prairie, as you see behind us, is a very diverse ecosystem. The original prairie that Europeans saw when they first arrived here was millions of acres. It was most often described by the new coming Europeans as an ocean of grass and wildflowers. That has been pretty much fragmented, chopped up, and reduced, so that whole ecosystem is now agriculture and towns and cities. What we found is, as is so often the case, when you're about to lose something is when you realize how valuable it is, and that's certainly been true of prairie. So this great ecosystem of grasses and other flowering plants and wildlife is being restored now before it's gone.
Today we're conducting a prescribed burn at Meisner Corn Forest Preserve, about 29 acres of restored tallgrass prairie.
Our main objective today is mostly as a maintenance burn to try to help keep small trees and other woody species out of the prairie. The native prairie plants, they evolved with the presence of fire. They're all adapted to fire. They have deep root systems. Many of them are perennial species, so the fire is not killing them. A lot of the non-native species that have been introduced, they aren't quite as fire adapted, so fire helps control a lot of those non-native species for us. So it serves as a really good tool for us for doing weed management.
Well, the key natural assets, the habitat that the Forest Preserve is really focusing on, is going back to the prairie, the woodlands, the wetlands, the stream corridors. One of the very unique and high quality areas is the Fox River Fen, located in Elgin, where the Fox River Country Day School was.
We're at the Forested Fen, which is just north of Trout Park in Elgin. Only 2% of Illinois was ever covered in Forested Fen, and of all that remains, just this 27-acre spot and south of I-90 at Trout Park are the only remnants that have been protected. So here at the Forested Fen, we have both the rare fen habitat, but we also have what we call a mesic oak hickory complex, and that's what we're looking at right now. It's obviously dominated by oaks and shagbark hickories, but we can also determine the quality of the woods based off of the composition of the understory. So some of the species we passed were bottlebush grass and Joe Pye weed, and there's some verbena here, but there's also a number of high quality rarer plants which really help us define this as a high quality woodland worthy of protection. So if we just come down here, you can start to glimpse one of the iconic species that makes this a forested fen, and that's the white cedar. You can see it's a multi-trunk tree, and its Latin name is Thuja occidentalis, and you really don't see this in Illinois. You really don't see it in a lot of fens either. And a fen is a wet area adjacent to a river that's kind of fed by the same watershed, but different fens have different compositions based off of the minerals that are leaching out of the soil. In this case, we have a calcareous fen, so it has a high calcium content. But some other unique characteristics are what allows the white cedar to grow here, which supports its own suite of species, both plant and animal. So we're really at the southern range of the thuja. You can find this all over Michigan and different parts of Wisconsin, but only in Elgin can you find it in Illinois. So here's a scenic little corner of this property. We're looking at the outflow of the seep that's coming out of the fen. It also makes the fen, but down here it makes a little more of a ravine type habitat. The overstory are these Thuja occidentalis, these white cedars. It's shaded in a great way, so it's easy to see why we would want to protect something like this. This is what we're looking for when we're looking to acquire land. I like to see the best of what's left. To find the special places, put protection on them, not just for our generations, but generations to follow, and if we can, help make it better than we found it.
We're at Bluff Spring Fen Nature Preserve. Bluff Spring Fen is a site that is tucked in behind Bluff City Cemetery, located on the southeast side of Elgin. And in Illinois, there are only about 120 acres of fen wetlands that survive. This site is about 135 acres in size, but the fen wetlands comprise about 20 acres. So this site represents about easily over 10% of all of the fen wetlands that survive in the entire state of Illinois.
So it's worth protecting.
That's the understatement of the day, yes. In Illinois, over the course of 5 generations, an estimated 20 million acres of prairie was reduced to about 2,000 acres. And so resource professionals and the public have realized we've lost something special. And so now it's critically important that we reassemble some of these native prairie landscapes, because they won't survive for another generation or two as small, isolated units. They really need to be larger, and they really should be connected together.
Kane County, along with various municipalities and townships, consider preservation of open space an important part of planning and development. In the early 2000s, Campton Township took the opportunity to purchase one of the oldest dairy farms in this area, the Corin Farm, and preserve it for open space and prairie restoration.
The dairy business had been going downhill as far as being profitable to dairy farmers, not only for us, but many in the area. It was very difficult to make ends meet. You know, Dave and Bob were farming back then, and an opportunity came up through some federal funds funneled through the state for open space. In Campton Township was interested in preserving this farm here as open space.
My brother and I were both in our 50s, and it was like there was no one to take over. My daughter is the only one in the next generation, and she was never going to milk a cow. The buildings needed some maintenance, and there was simply not enough money to manage that. So when the township offered a competitive price with developers, we took advantage of the opportunity at that point to sell.
We're walking through a good part of the prairie here at Corin Farm. Of the 220 acres that we have here, about half is native prairie, restored native prairie, as well as the oak savannas and the wetlands that we have in the back. When we purchased the farm in 2001, this was still farmed, and there were some cows and other animals here. In 2004, we started the restoration effort to revert it back to native prairie.
It's part of our history. We're the prairie state. Our whole state economy was built on this rich soil, and so it's part of our history. It's also very beautiful. When we look down this lawn and there's just nothing here to see, and compared to that, it's very beautiful. And just the rarity of it. It's so rare. We tend to value things that are rare, and so prairie was everywhere originally, so hey, there's plenty of it, we can plow it up. Today it's so incredibly rare that, you know, there's 1/100th of 1% of the original prairie left in high quality condition in the whole state. That's less than 4 square miles. So it's just very, very rare.
We can't stop development, and I don't think we espouse that. Development's going to happen. But I think one of the things that we do try to push is a concept of sustainable development. You know, matching the development with the needs and the resources of the community. We do want to strike that balance between open space, both active and passive recreation, and preserving our environment.
Money from open space initiatives and offers from developers present compelling and often perplexing options for family farmers. But what about the farmer who just wants to stay on the land? Kane County has a program that allows for just that.
So in the 1990s, county leadership started to think about how can we actually promote and preserve the agricultural sector in Kane County. Rather than just taking the land and shifting it to a non-agriculture use, could we find a way to really enhance and preserve agricultural land? So the county's farmland protection program was created, where the county is simply purchasing the development rights. And in these cases, the farmer, the landowner, continues to own the rights to the farm, continue to use it for agricultural production. And it's a wonderful program because it allows that landowner to stay on that farm, know that that land will be preserved into perpetuity for agricultural use. So it's a landmark enterprise, an idea, a system by which agriculture can be preserved, and the landowner and those around him know that you have our support to stay there as an ongoing farm operation.
There are many financial factors affecting the local family farm. The economy of scale in agriculture today favors large, so-called mega farms. It's difficult for the small family farmer to compete at this scale, but there is a growing, locally sourced, farm-to-table movement that is helping farmers stay on the farm.
My name's Tyler Strum, and I am Managing Director of an organization called Farm Illinois. Farm Illinois stands for Food and Agriculture Roadmap. And this is a statewide effort that is looking to aggregate leadership across the full food and agriculture supply chain in Illinois. So when you think of Illinois' agricultural production system, even though that we're one of the world's biggest agricultural producers. Less than 5% of our fruit and vegetable that's consumed in Illinois is produced in Illinois. So we're actually importing about 95% of our fruit and vegetable needs. And when you think about the opportunity that exists in a city like Chicago, where you have 9 million people in the Chicago and surrounding area that are eating 3 meals a day, and we're only supporting less than 5% of that with our own fruit and vegetable capacity, there's a lot of potential for growth here. If we just increase that another 5%, that'd be another $2.5 billion worth of economic activity that we would be able to help grow in Illinois. So it's really important for consumers to really purchase with their food dollars and to be able to support local and regional food systems. And it's important to look at the label and try to source locally and support locally as often as possible. Reasons include that you're reducing the carbon footprint, you're reducing the number of food miles that this produce has to travel, you're supporting your local farmers. It's well known about the economic multiplier effect of supporting locally, where those food dollars actually stay within the community. When you think about the freshness of the food and the quality of the food and the nutritional value, a lot of times you're going to get better quality food if you're buying it locally, because it went through a shorter supply chain, it traveled a shorter distance to get to your table. So with Farm Illinois, we're really looking at the full food and ag supply chain, and that's from the very large scale to the very small scale. And what we're seeing is a really significant driving need in the local regional food space. And this is directly where elements of farm to fork, direct market, community supported agriculture all fit in.
The farm to table movement is great because that does what I've been talking about for years, brings farmers a little closer to consumers. There are niche markets. The thing that bothers me a little bit in agriculture is the fights we have between organic farmers and non-organic farmers, and the argument we have that organic food is better for you. I haven't seen any medical proof for that, but anything we can do to bring farmers and urban consumers closer together, I like. But I don't like the infighting that we have saying my food is better than your food. Don't turn it into a war or into a fight.
Hi, my name is Cliff McConville. I'm the owner of Allgrass Farms in Dundee, Illinois. So this is the Bruner Family Forest Preserve. So this is land that's been farmed for well over 100 years. Actually, it's been a dairy farm. It's owned by the King County Forest Preserve now. They purchased it about 10 years ago. And so I approached them because I saw this beautiful dairy barn. So I talked to them about maybe leasing the barn and moving our operation over here. And we have a farm store on site that's open 7 days a week from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. And in the store we sell raw milk as well as grass-fed beef and pasture-raised eggs, chicken, pork. Our big draw really is the raw milk. We have one of the 3 permits to sell raw milk in the state of Illinois right now, and so people drive from a long ways to get it. We have some people that come for 2 hours away to get raw milk from us. You know, the small dairy farmers have really been pressured in recent years, the last several decades really. You've seen, you know, thousands and thousands of small farms have gone under. And the primary reason is that economies of scale now favor those really large producers because the price of conventional milk, you know, not organic, has pretty much stayed flat for the last 20, 30 years. It hasn't moved at all. It's about, you know, $12 to $15 per hundredweight. And so the only farms that are prospered in that environment with all the costs going up are those that get really big. You know, they have thousands of cows. It's not unusual to find dairies that have, you know, 5,000, 10,000 cows now. And they're able to make money at those types of prices. But the small farm, you know, the guy down the street that's got 100 cows, there's no way he can make it. So a lot of those small farmers, if they want to get a price premium, they can transition to organic. So organic milk right now, last time I checked, is about $40, you know, per hundredweight. So if you think about that, that's about 3 times the price you get for conventional milk. Our niche is a little different with the raw milk, but it's still a niche. The market is kind of either you got to get really big or you got to specialize as being, you know, a niche. And we sell direct, so there's no middleman. I don't have to send my milk into a dairy and take whatever price. We get to set our own price. So that makes a difference. We're able to keep that whole, kind of what I would say, that processor's margin. We keep all of that.
The locally sourced food movement is gaining steam in Elgin and in Kane County. Dream Hub and Dream Distributors, located behind me, is a new local food hub that sources produce from local farmers and distributes it to neighboring restaurants and grocery stores. Shared Harvest is another local initiative that will provide a retail cooperative in Elgin where consumers can buy directly from local farmers. This locally sourced movement has crossed over into something called agrihoods. These are where sustainable communities are integrated within active working farms. One example is just west of Elgin.
Saracen Farms is a farm community. One of the new terms is agrihood. The concept here is trying to save and preserve farmland by allowing a little bit of development, about 114 homes here on 410 acres. At the same time then preserving that farm and ensuring that that farm has a future. We see it as a trend that people want to be closer to that pastoral lifestyle, and actually food is a big part of it. We're growing sustainable vegetables and a lot of specialty produce here, and that food element is very appealing to people.
Well, we're back on McDonald Road at the Gatham Farm. Behind me, they're breaking grounds on a 504 single-family home subdivision called the Ponds of Stony Creek. Off to my left is the historic Corn Farm, now owned by Campton Township. This is a fitting location for our closing thoughts on this documentary. How do we manage growth to preserve open space and protect significant ecosystems while retaining our agricultural heritage and providing for responsible development? These issues will ultimately determine the quality of life and the economic vitality of our communities for generations to come. Part of the mission of the Elgin History Museum is to help our residents better understand our collective heritage and be prepared to plan for the future in a way that honors our past.
It was an architect out of Elgin, W.W. Abel was his name, and he actually did a lot of designing bridges and things like that, I guess. So it was a little bit, odd that he, designed the barn, but my great-grandfather, Lester Teeple, he contacted him about coming up with this shape and design of the barn, and it was built in 1885. It is 85 feet in diameter. It was 85 feet tall, but it actually had 16 flat sides to it, yes. It was quite big. I mean, there was a lot of round barns and shaped barns like that that were much smaller than that. So a lot of people ask me, why was it that shape? And I quite honestly don't know. I think he just wanted something different too, because it was real different than others in the area.
We're in Campton Hills, Illinois, just west of St. Charles. The farm's been here since 1983 and moved into the new facility here in January of 2018. The new facility is an upgrade from our previous stanchion-style barn or tie-style barn, which was built roughly in the 50s or 60s. The new facility features a fully automated cow milking system, automatic manure collection system, and even automated feed pushing system. We really love the area that we're in St. Charles, Campton Hills. It's not common to see a new facility or even a farm expand in this area. Usually they sell the ground and move further west. But we wanted to keep the agricultural heritage that's been here for so many years and be able to show people what a modern dairy farm can look like. It's not your grandpa's farm, it's not a red barn with pasture, but it's a farm where cows are very well taken care of, people have a very good lifestyle, and you can have it in a nice part of Illinois. We want to be good stewards of the land, we want to be good neighbors, so we've taken some extra steps to be a good neighbor, to be a friendly farm that people can be proud to live near and be part of their community.